Good afternoon and welcome to Matters Financial and Geopolitical from the Frontier. I hope the week's gone well, and I wish for your safety, security of yourself and your family and your loved ones. Let me start with macro thoughts again. Nothing has changed. What's certain is that the whole global economy has been hit by an insidious, literally invisible circuit breaker. Policymakers somehow still believe in their linear minds that more free money, more rate cuts will resuscitate the patient. A V-shaped recovery, in my view, remains a fantasy. Come to think of it, no one expected negative money market rates, then the 10-year, then the entire yield curve, then oil. Sun Chartist. I also know that we're about to enter the Great Depression, and we had a slew of data yesterday, French numbers, unemployment numbers, all confirming the same. And the virus is not correlated to endogenous market dynamics, but is an exogenous uncertainty that remains unresolved until now. Millions file for unemployment, stock market soars, is becoming a common occurrence, tells you everything, Peter Dow. And I thought to myself actually that Zimbabwe and Venezuela are the precursor for the stock market soaring. If you go and look at both those countries where we had rampant money printing, both the stock markets really performed well, of course, not in hard currency terms. Goldman Sachs stay-at-home basket starting to top, Tommy Thornton. I would be a buyer on any reverses of that, because I think the exogenous uncertainty remains unresolved, and therefore we're going to be in quarantine for much longer than the optimists are predicting. Home thoughts, magic on screen, iconic scenes from Satyajit Ray's masterpieces. I love his movies, but they're terribly depressing, and the pace is very slow because it's of a different era. But they are works of art, and I urge you just to watch these little clips to get a flavour. Sublime dawn in Mombasa, Kenya pics. May 21st, 2017, good morning from the seaside. I was staying at the Serena on the north coast of Mombasa, and I took that photograph of the early morning. December 26th, 2014, I took this photo from English Point Marina, looking towards the old town and Fort Jesus. This is a photograph of Fort Jesus, which I visited so many times. And here's a photograph from inside the fort, looking out, following the line of sight of a cannon, which must have been shot a few times at various invading sorts. The king of Mombasa was not friendly to Vasco da Gama and the Portuguese fleet. Fort Jesus had changed hands. The Malindi king prepared a huge feast and gave Vasco da Gama a sailor to travel to Calcutta, India. That was a very interesting interview I did with a Portuguese lady regarding the Portuguese exploration of the Indian Ocean. People will die if we get cocky about reopenings, said the New York governor, Cuomo. Salman Rushdie, very interesting interview in The Spectator on the age of anything can happen. Well worth a listen, 60 minutes. My favourite sentence of his is from a book called Imaginary Homelands. And in that he says, ours is the most cryptic of centuries, its true nature a dark secret. He also said fundamentalism isn't about religion, it's about power. A pair of boys playing football in Jerusalem's old city. That's from N. Tarnopolsky. This was a photograph that Ken Uduni posted last night, sunset in Chalet Island, and I'll tell you of an extraordinary trip we had there once. The tide comes in and goes out. When the tide is out, you can literally walk across to the island. And when the tide comes in, you've got to take a boat. And we'd gone there, and on our way back, for some silly reason, all the ladies and children got in one boat, and the men happened to get in another. And then the boat that the ladies and children were in started to just drift out to sea. It was quite an extraordinary situation. Fortunately, no one got injured. I wrote about the way we live now, and I quoted Don DeLillo, who said everything is barely weeks, everything is days. We have minutes to live. Certainly feels like that, doesn't it? 50 years past the first Earth Day, a frayed planet and a sublime one. The New Yorker, writing about the 50th anniversary of the first Earth Day, let's think for a moment about the Earth, backdrop for our busy and dramatic life, but also a planet. And a lovely photograph was posted with that article. Yes, forests have begun to burn with shocking intensity, but others remain calm, quiet, sometimes with the spring of moss underfoot. This photograph is by Eve Herman of Reuters. There is something karmic, I wrote, in this COVID-19. And I was referencing how the Vatican had closed down, how Com had closed down, how the Hajj will not happen this year. And then all those other stories of super spreading events. Why I love Kenya, stay at home, you'll find us here, Mohammed Hersi. The saliva of COVID-19 patients can harbor 500 billion virus particles per teaspoon, and a cough aerosolizes it into a diffuse mist. Political Reflections, latest on COVID-19, there are now 2.71 million confirmed cases and 190,636 deaths worldwide. William Yang. Iran's Revolutionary Guard commander, Major General Hussein Salami, said, "We instructed our naval units to respond and destroy any US ship or destroyer that tries to threaten our security," he said. And I thought to myself, it's probably best to just shoot some COVID-19 droplets. That would be asymmetric warfare par excellence. Nobody likes to hear this, but it is the truth. We're not living through the final phase of this crisis. We are still at its beginning. We will still have to live with this virus for a long time, Angela Merkel, of whom I said leaders are saying don't panic, and I want to say look, chum, you're not Merkel, and just a few days ago you were telling me it's all cool and it's just the flu. Others might take you seriously, on what basis I know not, but I don't. What is clear is that the Malcolm Gladwell moment has definitively arrived, and he described the tipping point in an epidemic when a virus reaches critical mass. It's the boiling point, it's the moment on the graph when the line starts to shoot straight upwards. What is absolutely clear, I wrote on the 24th of February, is we're dealing with a virus that has turned exponential and nonlinear and is a pandemic. You will recall the debate about WHO not calling it a pandemic until 10 past midnight. And in that same article, I said the viral moment has arrived. Many countries continue to report more than 1,000 new cases each day. That's Remy GMI. Hidden outbreaks spread through US cities far earlier than Americans' new estimates say. By the time New York City confirmed its first case of the coronavirus on March 1st, thousands of infections were already silently spreading through the city. A hidden explosion of a disease that many still viewed as a remote threat as the city awaited the first signs of spring. Hidden outbreaks were also spreading almost completely undetected in Boston, San Francisco, Chicago, and Seattle, long before testing showed that each city had a major problem, according to a model of the spread of the disease by researchers at Northeastern University, who shared their results with the New York Times. Even in early February, while the world focused on China, the virus was not only likely to be spreading in multiple American cities, but also seeding blooms of infection elsewhere in the United States. As political leaders grappled in February with the question of whether the outbreak would become serious enough to order measures like school closures and remote work, little or no systematic testing for the virus was taking place. Meanwhile, in the background, you have the silent chain of transmission of thousands of people, said Alessandro Vespinani, director of the Network Science Institute at Northeastern University in Boston, who led the research team. Research offers the first clear accounting of how far behind the United States was in detecting the virus, and the findings provide a warning of what can recur, the researchers say, if social distancing restrictions are lifted too early. Through February 27, this country only had 14 cases. We did that isolation and that contact tracing, and it was very successful. But when the virus exploded, it got beyond the public health capacity. But new estimates of coronavirus infections are vastly higher than those official counts. Knowing the number of flights coming into New York from Italy, it was like watching a horrible train wreck in slow motion. We weren't testing, and if you're not testing, you don't know. Other signs that the outbreak was worse at an earlier point than previously known. This week, health officials in Santa Clara County announced a newly discovered coronavirus-linked death on February the 6th, weeks earlier than had been previously thought to be the first death caused by the virus in the United States. By the time you see a few cases, it's pretty certain you already have an outbreak underway. We knew the numbers we saw were just the tip of the iceberg, and there were much greater numbers below the surface. We had to act. We were talking to officials here, and it was the same reaction we got in Italy and the UK and Spain. They told me, okay, what's happening on your computer is not in reality. Look, no one's going to shut down a country based on a model. So I think that applies globally, and particularly in Africa, where we keep seeing these sort of very few numbers of cases, but clearly it's the tip of the iceberg. COVID-19 super spreader events in 28 countries, critical patterns and lessons is an outstanding long-form essay in Quillette. In 1899, a German bacteriologist named Karl Pflüger proved that microbes can be transmitted ballistically through large droplets that emit at high velocity from the mouth and nose. His method for proving the existence of these Pflüger droplets, as they came to be known, was to painstakingly count the microbe colonies growing on culture plates hit with the expelled secretions of infected lab subjects. More than 12 decades later, these large respiratory droplets have been identified as a transmission mode for COVID-19. A single heavy cough, it is now known, can expel as much as a quarter teaspoon of fluid in the form of fluid droplets. And the higher the exit velocity of the cough, the larger the globules that can be expelled. According to the binary model established in the 1930s, droplets typically are classified as either one, large globules of the Phlegian variety, arcing through the air like a tennis ball until gravity brings them down to Earth, or smaller particles less than 5 to 6 micrometers in diameter, roughly a tenth the width of a human hair, which drift lazily through the air as fine aerosols. Those mucosalivary droplets we emit are cocooned within a warm, moist, enveloping gas cloud, Baruba calls it a puff, that protects the droplets from evaporation, allows even small globules to travel much further than one might otherwise predict. The binary distinction between large and small droplets remains fundamental. Eventually, the big particles fall while the smaller ones don't. The science here is mind-bogglingly complex because modeling the puff's behavior requires that Baruba and her team model not only the dynamics of the puff as it travels and dissipates, but also the biophysical and thermodynamic processes unfolding within the gas cloud. But the overall upshot is that such a puff and its payload of pathogen-bearing droplets of all sizes can travel 7 to 8 meters, about 4 times the length of the 6-foot social distancing buffer zone we've all been taught to enforce since mid-March. It is on this crucial scale that our knowledge is thinnest, despite the passage of 4 months since the first known human cases of COVID-19. Our public health officials remain committed to policies that reflect no clear understanding as to whether it is one-off ballistic droplet payloads or clouds of fine aerosols that pose the greatest risk. No one has produced a comprehensive international database of large COVID-19 infection clusters or super spreading events, as they are sometimes referred to in the scientific literature, which would facilitate a systematic study of the forms of behavior that spread the disease most rapidly. And SSE expert Richard Stein put it in a definitive 2011 article: roughly 20% of the individuals within any given population are thought to contribute at least 80% to the transmission potential of typical pathogens. This writer's built his own, cataloguing 58 SSEs in 28 different countries. Search terms such as superspread, cluster, hotspot, or non-English variants such as superpropagadore. To cite one example was Liverpool's March 11 football match against Atletico Madrid and SSE, as many believe. In other cases, I've received private correspondence whose contents I've chosen to exclude, involving Purim parties in Israel, for instance, and a Swedish party at which a whistle apparently was passed around. Hospitals and old age homes, he's discounted that. The purpose of the exercise is to gain information about the relative effects of 3 broad modes of COVID-19 transmission: large droplets transmitted ballistically, persistent concentrations of tiny airborne droplets, and contaminated services. Many of the early SSEs, in fact, centered on weddings, birthday parties, and other events that were described in local media as glamorous or populated by socialites. March 7 engagement party at Rio de Janeiro mansion that attracted high society fly-ins from around the world, and a similarly described birthday party in Westport, Connecticut. Massive gatherings such as February's week-long Christian open-door prayer meeting in Mulhouse, France, which has been linked to an astounding 2,500 cases, and a massive Tablighi Jamaat Islamic event in Lahore that attracted 250,000 people. Parties or liquor-fueled mass attendance festivals of one kind or another, including celebrations of weddings, engagements, birthdays. 5 of the SSEs involved funerals. Categories sometimes overlap, as with patient A11 in Chicago, who attended both a party and a funeral in the space of a few days, or the New Rochelle, New York man who covered the SSE trifecta of bar mitzvah party, synagogue services, and local funeral, all the while going to his job as a lawyer in New York City. It's a tremendous article, well worth reading. It really has a lot of detail. High levels of noise do seem to be a common feature of SSEs, as such environments force conversationalists to speak at extremely close range. The danger starts even before the action begins. One of the most dangerous things you can do at a sports event in the COVID-19 era is to sing the national anthem. Even a layperson can see that there's a fairly clear pattern in the most notorious, destructive, and widely reported cases of mass COVID-19 infection, virtually all of which feature forms of human behavior that permit the direct ballistic delivery of a large droplet Phlegian payload from face A to face B. We still have no idea what the minimal infectious dose MID is for COVID-19, the number of viral particles required to start the pathogenesis cascade that causes a clinical disease. The key factor for infection was the direction of the airflow, with downstream individuals being most at risk. This was in a restaurant. As I picked up on the article in the Intelligencer, the saliva of COVID-19 patients can harbour 500 billion virus particles per teaspoon, and a cough aerosolizes it into a diffuse mist. There is something karmic in this COVID-19. It's invisible, but it has already defeated the most expensive aircraft carriers, lurks everywhere and in silence, and has closed down Mecca, St. Peter's Square, the Vatican, and much more. YouTube CEO Suzanne Wojcicki says anything that goes against the WHO is a violation of YouTube policies. That took me back to Professor Zhu Zhangruan. They're now turned to rule over the people by means of what could be dubbed big data totalitarianism and WeChat terror. You will all be no better than fields of garlic chives, giving yourselves up to being harvested by the blade of power time and time again. Urban achiever, really sick of the lamestream media hoping that injecting disinfectants won't work. What's wrong with a little optimism? This is following on President Trump, who made some rather startling assertions yesterday. A non-linear exponential virus represents the greatest risk to a control machine, as we know. As I copied William Burroughs, I said a paranoid is someone who knows a little of what's going on. Viruses exhibit non-linear and exponential characteristics. I was quoting Jenna Friedman, a reality TV star botched the response to a global pandemic, and now we're all imprisoned in our homes and forced to watch him daily. Here is Dr. Birx's reaction when President Trump asks his science advisor to study using UV light on the human body and injecting disinfectant to fight the coronavirus. This election is a choice between two competing visions for America. One that says you should drink bleach to cure viruses, and another that says do not drink bleach. To watch the daily briefing is to understand that the control machine has a novice, a hubristic Narcissus, in charge of the console. Dollar index, that's pretty strong, 100.607. I noticed emerging market currencies are under the cosh. Euro dollar is also soft, 107.44. Commodity markets, gold last at 1730. I'm of the view we'll go to 2000, as I've told you before. Look at this, the streets of Venezuela are covered with cash. This is what happens when hyperinflation destroys the value of money. And there's an argument that we got no velocity in the currency. Ignore those arguments. In a world where we're going to rampant money printing, as Scott Burke described at the print shop, there is only one safe haven, that's gold. The viral moment has arrived, as I said, on the 24th of February, and I would venture gold is correlated to the coronavirus, which is set to turn parabolic and is already non-linear and exponential. 22nd of March, I said I still believe gold will turn viral to the upside. We crossed 1740 and we're off to the races again. 150-year history of oil prices from Deutsche Bank via Robin Wig. On a serious note, there is a risk of sovereign defaults from nations that rely heavily on oil exports. Here's 2018 data for heavily exposed countries. Nick Carter. We're now entering the twilight zone for oil producers. What I do know is this regime implosion is coming to the oil producers. Demand has created a return to a hyper-connected 100 million barrels per day world is not going to happen for the foreseeable future. Oil in storage rises to a record 3.2 billion barrels, that's via Chigel. And the price of crude is perfectly correlated to this hard stop that we're currently encountering. Hunter S. Thompson, The Edge, there is no honest way to explain it because the only people who really know where it is are the ones who have gone over. Tullow Oil sells its stake in the Uganda project to Total for $575 million. That's a fire sale. Concluded a years-long process to sell its Ugandan assets to Total, $575 million. Collapse of the deal contributed to a calamitous year for Tullow. Apart from problems in Uganda and Kenya, faced technical difficulties in Ghana and the disappointing results from wells in Guyana. Net debt is $2.8 billion. It should be trading like the oil price did at a negative price. Emerging markets will reach 300,000 COVID cases this week, but we are looking in the rearview mirror. At the start of the year, $1 bought you 4 Brazilian reals. It now buys you 5.53. That's a 38% rise for the dollar. As Bolsonaro likes to say, the truth will set you free. Protesters back to the streets across Lebanon. The national currency is depreciated by more than 60%, and the government has failed to make any decisions to help the situation. I described that in an article in October 2019 called The New Economy of Anger. Madagascar president launches coronavirus remedy. Tests have been carried out. 2 people have now been cured by this treatment. Rajulina, previously a disc jockey, told ministers, diplomats and journalists at the Malagasy Institute of Applied Research, which developed the beverage. This herbal tea gives results in 7 days. Downing a dose, he said, I will be the first to drink this today in front of you to show you that this product cures and does not kill. The drink has been called COVID Organics, is derived from Artemisia, a plant with proven efficacy in malaria treatment and other indigenous herbs. Regilina brushed aside any such reservations and said the concoction would be offered to school children as it was his duty to protect the Malagasy people. So there you go. Virus deaths may not be the greatest challenge ahead for Africa. This is Aidan Hartley in The Spectator. In the coming months, cut flowers may become a sight as rare as bananas were for children in the Blitz. Accurately calculating total deaths from COVID-19 in Africa will involve greater guesswork even than elsewhere. since mathematical modeling tends to get lost in the Congo's rainforests or the shifting sands of Somalia. In other words, the pandemic's main victims might be aging politicians and their hangers-on who find themselves unable to fly their private jets to Europe for treatment, a cull of sugar-fed, obese oligarchs. Governor Mike Sonko promised mass distribution of Hennessy cognac because alcohol plays a major role in killing the coronavirus. But such clowning aside, slum dwellers have no cash reserves, nor a welfare state to rescue them. The recent mistreatment of black people in Guangzhou has horrified Africans who know where the virus came from. China has flooded the continent with its citizens who along the way have set out to poach and eat every African wild species imaginable. Yet there is a silver lining. Some years ago, Arab rulers of Sudan shut down the pipeline that traverses its territory towards the Red Sea, pumping crude oil production from its southern neighbor, South Sudan. When the embargo hit, I predicted social collapse, yet nothing changed because South Sudan's rulers had always stolen all the oil money. Ministers' fat sons had to cut back on spare parts for their gold-plated Hummers, whereas most local people simply woke up in the morning to dig their fields and to grow sorghum, manioc, and vegetables. In the same way now, people across Africa will struggle by on the land, relying on extended family relationships. Unless there is a dramatic reordering of the system, some states will fail, swept away in urban uprisings and fresh civil conflicts. Surely it's time to abolish or reform the edifice of international aid that has propped up this kleptocracy for decades, the racket run by UN agencies and leftist charities like Oxfam. COVID-19 is a Chernobyl moment for bad regimes and badly managed aid programs in Africa. Pestilence heralds a time of change, more dramatic perhaps than any since the colonial scramble for Africa. It's the end of an epoch and an opportunity for ordinary Africans to build a better future. I was writing about Africa and I got a bit depressed and I said Africa is simply too dreadful to contemplate, but Aidan is a little bit more optimistic. I said then we're weeks away from collapsing healthcare systems and blow-ups in our urban centres. 2nd of March, when there was some skepticism as to whether this disease or this virus would come to Africa, I said we know that coronavirus is exponential, non-linear and multiplicative. And we know what it looks like. Nothing, 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 then cluster, 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 then boom. Somalia is leading with a 1,044% increase in the number of confirmed cases, followed by Cape Verde, 813%, and Tanzania, 788%. It would not be an exaggeration to say we're staring into the abyss of a zombie apocalypse. Growth in sub-Saharan Africa in 2020 is projected at minus 1.6%, the lowest level on record. It's going to be worse than that. Coronavirus cases in Africa could shoot up from thousands now to 10 million within 3 to 6 months, according to WHO. We are looking in the rearview mirror. I've written about debt, virus and locusts creating a perfect storm for Africa in early March in the Africa Report, and now panic as residents of Samburu struggle with a new swarm of desert locusts. 14th of October, I was writing about Ozymandias, referencing the African continent, and I said, my name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. Nothing beside remains round the decay of that colossal wreck. Boundless and bare, the lone and level sands stretch far away. This is the Mobutu Sese Seko mansion. Don't be blinded by materialistic things. Nature will acquire what rightfully belongs to it. Live a simple but peaceful life. China, as I wrote in my latest article, has an option to buy in sub-Saharan African assets at fire sale prices. Nikki Haley, this was China's plan all along, to run up the debt of these developing countries, and when they couldn't pay them back, China would take their assets. We warned them this would happen. South Africa's Cyril Ramaphosa said on Thursday the government will allow a partial reopening of the economy on May 1st. He's been rather impressive, quite scientific, and I am quite impressed with him, I must say. South Africa has now screened more than 3.6 million people in its communities, searching for people with symptoms of coronavirus. Of those, about 24,000 were sent for full testing. It's an excellent effort to search actively for cases rather than waiting passively in hospitals. South African all shares down 13.11%, dollar rand at 19.128, Egyptian pound 15.78, EGX 30 down 27.51% year to date. Foreign investors, dollars in lockdown in Nigeria debt market, trapped in Nigeria's debt market as dollar liquidity dries up due to a lack of fresh inflows. Some bondholders who sold local currency securities in March have been unable to repatriate their proceeds weeks after. Everyone is a buyer of dollars, but there's hardly any seller after the central bank stopped dollar supply since March 30. Trapped investors are reinvesting funds in high-yielding central bank bills while they await enough liquidity to get their funds out. And this is what I was writing in an article, 9th December, time to big up the dosage of Quaaludes. I was referencing Moody's downgrade. Basically, foreign investors were propping up the naira in December to the tune of $16 billion. I said then everyone knows how this story ends. When the music stops, everyone will dash for the exit and the currency will collapse. The only reason it's not collapsing is they're not allowed to get out of the exit. Nigeria's oil revenue is cratering and a currency devaluation, I said, is predicted and predictable. Nigerian oil shares down 16.29% year to date. Ghana's stock exchange is down 4.55% year to date. African airlines could lose $6 billion in passenger revenue in 2020. IATA. I said our airlines are no longer going concerns on the 22nd of March. The crash of the $8.5 billion global flour trade, outrageously good article in Business Week. $8.5 billion global trade in cut flours shows how quickly and distinctively the new coronavirus is disrupting supply chains, even in places where it isn't yet pervasive. It's an open question whether and when consumers will start spending again, not this year. Soon as the number of COVID-19 cases in New Jersey passed 1,000, the governor ordered all but essential businesses to close. Florists didn't make the cut. Royal Flora Holland now runs 4 auction sites that handle the bulk of the global trade. Its facility in Aalsmeer, concrete warehouse larger than 75 soccer fields, is one of the biggest buildings in Europe. Each day before sunrise, workers fill it with truckloads of chrysanthemums, roses, tulips. Buyers assemble in rooms filled with computer screens where photos of each lot are displayed. As the lots are bought, electric tractors pull long trains of wagons loaded with blooms from one side of the warehouse to the other. Spring is usually a busy season, but after Italy imposed a national lockdown, France ordered non-essential stores to close and Germany called for the cancellation of most events. The market collapsed. Rose prices dropped to 7 to 8 US cents a stem that day, down 70% from their price a year earlier. Before the pandemic, 42 of the cargo flights arriving at Aalsmeer each week came from Kenya. East African nation ships about $1 billion worth of flowers a year. More than 150,000 people toil on Kenyan flower farms, many of them women. It's a black hole. If this goes on for 3 or 4 months, we're faced with the prospect of closing down. Near empty shelves at Claire's shop, harvesting flowers inside a greenhouse in Naivasha, and Kenya's flower industry, the largest exporter of blooms to Europe, is staring at a disaster, I wrote on the 22nd of March. The cabinet secretary here in Kenya has done his first big expenditure. This is from Ahmed Nasir. 40 billion shillings. Have a look through as to what they're spending it on. 24 new cases at the port alone. How do we trace all their contacts? Fauz asks. It's gone very viral down at the coast, predictably. Kenya COVID-19 Google mobility report. Kenyans are basically shut down in all areas from going to work, shopping to outdoor activities, including travel. Kenya shilling 107.45. Nairobi all share down 17.34%. NEC 20 down 25.75%. Thank you for listening. Wishing you a great weekend.